broadband offers us an avenue to share in the most important resource on the planet, and that resource is knowledge.
The pandemic has really shown that broadband is just like electricity and just like water. You really need it these days to survive.
How do we get broadband everywhere? How do we get everybody on it? And how do we utilize it better for certain public purposes like education, healthcare, job training, economic growth?
The Senate is debating a $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill this week. One key portion expands broadband internet access for millions of Americans.
This is Opportunity Miami, a show about the entrepreneurs, civic leaders, and innovators who are solving the issues that will define Miami's economic future. I'm Matt Hagman. We're doing things a little differently this episode, recording this from my home on my iPhone. For those on video, this will be a change from our first 3 episodes. And as we move forward, we're going to switch things up now and then. And this is one of those times. A devastating pandemic has brought into sharp focus what has been discussed for decades: the need for a broadband infrastructure plan to keep Americans connected. In so many ways, internet access in a home is now as important as electricity or running water. It's how people look for jobs, learn, shop, and receive healthcare. But across the country, many people still don't have access. In Miami-Dade alone, nearly a quarter of homes don't have access to the internet. And that's not uncommon in other large metropolitan areas across the country. Yet, the federal government is now making the largest investment ever in an effort to finally close what for years has been called the digital divide. Within the recently passed infrastructure bill is this once-in-a-lifetime initiative in which the federal government has committed $65 billion to improve broadband internet access across the country, including making it more affordable for low-income households. What does this mean for Miami? And can we finally achieve universal broadband access? Today, we uncover some answers. Powered by the Beacon Council, this is Opportunity Miami. What if we were to increase internet access and households here in the Miami metropolitan area from a little more than 75% where we are today to more than 95% of households? With the infrastructure bill, we in Miami and communities across the country now have that chance. And Blair Levin thinks we could do it over the next 5 to 7 years. But he also says we're not going to get this chance again. Namely, he doesn't think we'll ever see another federal investment in broadband like this one in our lifetimes. Levin previously served as the executive director of the National Broadband Plan. During the presidency of Bill Clinton, Levin was chief of staff to FCC Chairman Reed Hundt, and he is currently a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution and is executive director of GigU, the Next Generation Innovation Project, in an initiative seeking to support educational and economic development by accelerating the deployment of next generation networks. Blair joined us to discuss and to help us understand this transformational opportunity to end the digital divide that's now in front of us. Blair Levin, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So let's zoom out and talk big picture around broadband access in the United States. You've talked before about sort of there are 4 areas that we need to be thinking about as we think about internet access across the country. What are those 4 areas?
So I think that government policy should try to make sure that 4 things are true. Number 1, that broadband networks are everywhere, that they connect everybody. And you can have different definitions of broadband, but you want to have networks that are not just good for today's purposes, but for tomorrow. So future-proof broadband everywhere. The second one, everyone on. Today in the United States are about 70 million Americans who have access to broadband but aren't on. Some of that's about digital literacy, some of it's about the cost of a computer, but mostly it's about the affordability of the monthly service. So you want to make sure it's affordable to everyone. The third is you want to have a broadband ecosystem that is competitive, that's dynamic, that's innovative, that where kind of the rules of the road are fair to everybody. Because the broadband service is really about a network of networks. So you have networks connecting with each other. You want to make sure that they connect fairly, but it's also connecting to applications. So you need rules of the road to do that. And the fourth thing is you want to make sure we're actually utilizing it to really accomplish society's goals. Can we use broadband to improve outcomes in healthcare, in workforce development, in public safety, in education, in civic engagement? So you have that availability agenda, the adoption agenda, the competitive, innovative agenda, and the utilization agenda.
And if you were to give a grade in each of those four areas as a country, and we'll drill down on Miami, how are we doing?
Well, I hesitate to give grades because grades tell the kid, how did you do this last semester? And what I would say is, if I grade it as in terms of a snapshot, I don't know. I'd probably give a B on most of the issues. There's certainly in every category there are countries that are doing it better. In every category there are countries that are doing it far worse. But the big thing to understand at this moment in time, we are at an historic juncture because Congress, for the first time, has decided to devote tens of billions of dollars to solve three of the four problems I talked about. The third problem is not really a dollar problem. It's about rules of the road. We can chat about that, but the thing that's always been lacking is the money to make sure the first two problems in particular are solved. And then the fourth problem is partly about money, partly about policy.
Well, so if we're thinking about the first two, and that's about having the network, and that's then the second one being about getting everyone on. As we think about a place like Miami, really the network, that more, when thinking about having the proper network, that's imagining more like rural places, right? In terms of well-developed, large metropolitan areas, the network is pretty much there. Is that right?
Well, not only is the network there, in Miami and in most large cities, you have two pretty good networks. One is a cable company. And what the cable industry has done is taken their network, which was designed to deliver video, and really transitioned it to deliver data. And they're constantly upgrading it. And they've really been the leader in rapid and big bandwidth. And then you also have the telco network. Initially everybody got the internet over the telephone network. It was called dial-up. It was a crappy service. But back in the labs, back in the 80s, they developed something called digital subscriber lines. They didn't want to roll out digital subscriber lines because they were making so much money on the dial-up where they were selling a separate line. But when the cable industry came in with broadband, and this was very slow broadband, but it was broadband, 3 megabits, 4 megabits, the dial-up didn't work anymore, so they rolled out DSL. Then as cable upgraded, the phone companies have upgraded, and now you see a lot of phone companies upgrading to fiber, which is, reasonable minds can differ. But both the fiber network and the current cable network are both outstanding networks that can really serve all the applications we can think of for today.
So the real problem for a place like Miami really is around getting everyone on. And in fact, just before our call, went online and looked at the census report for the latest one for Miami-Dade, and it actually had about 23% of the population here in Miami-Dade County, about 3 million people total, don't have internet access. And we're talking almost a quarter of the population. Internet has become arguably like water now. So that, to me, as a resident of Miami, does strike me as an alarming number. But in terms of how to make sense of it, it's a common number.
That number is probably similar in most of the big cities.
It's sort of a good news, bad news. Maybe we're not so far behind other cities. On the other hand, how is it that the richest country in the world has its large metropolitan areas where nearly a quarter of the population who aren't online? Is the problem. It is both a money issue, but also a training and skills issue. Talk about how cities are actually making a dent or hope to make a dent and moving from being in the 70s to into the 90s.
Yeah. So there are, two very big issues. One is what you might think of as digital capabilities. And whether you conceive of it as training or digital literacy or whatever, it just means, when somebody, it's not intuitive that someone who maybe even isn't literate and can't read can get on a computer and use Google search or do whatever and find it a useful tool, right? In a way that everybody can watch television, everybody can listen to music on the radio. Using the internet is interactive. And so there is some training component. There are various population groups, particularly elderly people, but also certain demographic groups where there just isn't that training. So cities play a huge role, whether it be through libraries, community centers, and other things in terms of helping train. The federal government has never spent any material amount of money to do that. The infrastructure bill puts aside about $2.5 billion to do that. So cities like Miami and others will be, trying to get millions of dollars in grants to run programs to train people. And I think that's great. It's, we, in a way, it's a one-time problem. We need a surge of activity to make sure that anyone who wants to get on the internet has the necessary training. But the bigger problem is affordability. Roughly speaking, the bottom price is 30 or 40 bucks a month. There's just a lot of people, if they're going to pay that, they're going to be giving up on water or some other bill that they have to pay, rent or food and stuff like that. So that's a more serious problem. The one thing that people think is, well, we just need more competition. But competition's actually hard. The economics of the build out of the network are such that to pay for the network and get a good return, you need about a 30% market share in most cities. It's very hard to have three competitors, each with 30%, and just barely getting by. And so what we've seen is the two, the cable and the telco, they both do fine. They both do actually very well, but it's very hard to get a third in. Google Fiber, great brand, all the money in the world, a lot of network engineers, very difficult to make that business model work. It does work in some places. It does work differently with apartment buildings, but there is no example where competition drove internet prices to a lower level that low-income people could afford it, where you really have a big uptake. So what we're seeing is that the federal government had a $10 a month program that then became a $50 a month program and is now a $30 a month program, but with Congress funding it for billions of dollars, and we'll see how it goes. But that should be enough to enable low-income people to essentially get it for free. And this is a new program. We're going to have to see how it goes. But that number that you're talking about, that should be, we should aspire to have somewhere in the mid to high 90s, which is what we have for electricity, water, and sewer and stuff. You never get 100%.
And is the mid to the high 90s, is that a goal that you think that can be achieved in the U.S., achieved in Miami in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years? What's a reasonable time frame?
I think 5 to 7 years. I don't think it should take us 10. It may even be shorter, but what Congress did was fund the low-income adoption program, but roughly speaking, probably only funded it for 3 to 5 years. Congress also asked the FCC to come up with a long-term plan. So we'll see what the plan is. We'll see what kind of money is there. Like any new program, there are going to be mistakes. There are going to be problems. But this is a solvable problem. And in the same way that we subsidize food because we don't want anyone to go without it, we subsidize healthcare because, the Medicaid program, market forces are never going to make it low enough. We've now said essentially what you said at the beginning. Broadband is essential. We need to make sure everyone is on it. We can do that. It's not rocket science, but right. We'll see whether government forces align to make it so.
And just to be clear, and so the infrastructure bill is the biggest federal investment in broadband access in our history, correct?
Correct.
And I think
By
you
far.
said also that we by far, and you also said that this is essentially a one of one, that we will not see this again. Why?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. There are a lot of people saying, "Oh boy, this is a once in a generation," and I keep saying, "No, it's once. That's it. We either get it done right, and the reason for it is simply this: if we don't get it right, it's inconceivable to me that some Congress is going to say, "Oh, yeah, well, they just wasted $100 billion," and you can argue about the actual amount, but it's order of magnitude $100 billion. So let's do it again. That's not the way it works. What's going to happen is we're going to get, we almost have, right now we have the networks reaching, 90% of the country. We have affordability reaching 75%. We're going to get high enough with this numbers that's going to be close enough that Congress just isn't going to say, oh, if we just had another 25 billion, we could do it. It just doesn't work that way. The forces that aligned to do this now, in terms of a new administration, in terms of monetary policy thinking, similar, by the way, to the way the Republicans felt about the tax bill. We don't have to pay for things, right? We can spend the money. We're not that worried about inflation. Those are weird combinations, but the single biggest thing was this: COVID taught everyone, governors, mayors, Congress, we need broadband everywhere. We need everybody on. I was the executive director of the National Broadband Plan. We basically talked about the four things I talked about earlier, and what's really clear to me is that COVID was a much better evangelist for the principles of universal broadband than the executive director of the National Broadband Plan. I mean, I could talk about the stuff, but like, who cared, right? But when COVID hit, it was amazing. Because look, we had 17 million school kids out of school. They couldn't participate in school. We can't afford that as a country.
So for the local elected leader here in Miami, or the concerned citizen here in Miami, what should we be doing in light of the infrastructure bill to be sure that we here and communities across the country realize the full potential of it?
Yeah. So let's go through those four pieces again, because I think local governments have different roles. As to the first, it's really going to be run by the state, but the state ought to be consulting with cities. And whereas most of the money is going to go to rural Florida to make sure that they have the networks they need, there's going to be enough money to do some interesting things. And so maybe the city needs to say, we need special free Wi-Fi in low-income apartment buildings, for example. Miami is doing a lot to become a tech center. Maybe you need not just gigabit networks, but you need like essentially industrial parks or certain kinds of facilities where you have the most advanced networking possible, 10 gigabits, with capability of a lot more, so that augmented reality, virtual reality, cryptocurrency, those kinds of things that we need a lot more bandwidth, a lot more processing power. You want to build that economic development tool. So you want to weigh in on the availability of networks. You don't control it, but you ought to be watching what the state does and make sure that Miami gets what it needs. As to the adoption, boy, a lot of it is to do the digital training to make it effective, but also to make sure that everyone is aware of the federal government program that will subsidize people for $30 a month, and to work with local providers to make sure that there are packages that don't cost more than $30 that give people both the mobile and the in-home broadband, but also computers and things like that. That's probably the single biggest thing. The third thing, the rules of the road, those are generally going to be driven by federal and to some extent state. And so I would say, stay active, stay involved. These are issues like net neutrality. No need to debate them here. I'm just saying people should be engaged, but understand that the situation is going to be driven differently. The fourth one, boy, the city plays a huge role in delivering all kinds of government services. And if you envision a future where everybody's on, whether it be how do we make sure that everybody has job training that they need that suits their situation, or how do we deliver education? We're going to have a huge problem of kids who weren't in school falling behind when it comes to their reading. Well, what about a tutoring program where people are tutoring kids on a volunteer basis a half an hour a night? Look, it would be great if every parent read to their kids such that their kids could read early in life. That's not the reality. But if we can identify kids, we can identify tutors, and we can deliver this kind of service. So there's all kinds of things that cities can do to improve how they deliver all kinds of government services. And not only will the quality be better, but it'll actually, in the long run, be cheaper for the city.
So as we see with all of this happening, of course, we hear about 5G is now here. We hear about efforts like Starlink and other efforts, or shooting satellites into space to bring broadband access to us. We hear about startups like Underline. How should we think about these various efforts as we think about broadband access across the country?
Yeah. So most of those go to the first bucket of availability. Starlink is going to hopefully be helpful in closing the gap, kind of from the 98% to the 100%, because it's a much cheaper and it's a good service. But we'll see how that goes. It won't serve essential facilities like healthcare facilities or educational facilities or other big users of bandwidth. But for homes that are really remote, it should be a good service. But there are other services that might be much better for, again, low-income apartment where you have high density but problematic demographics in terms of the cost structure. There are various technologies that might work for that. But the real technologies that I think the city and the folks in Miami ought to be thinking about are those technologies that use the platform to improve how we deliver these essential services. That's where the real upside will be. But we got to get everybody on, because otherwise the consequences of the digital divide will be greater. And we really don't want that.
Wow. So it really feels like that to solve this, your point is that it needs government reform. Entrepreneurship, competition, private sector on its own won't get us there. And we actually have now got that reform. Now it's on us to really take advantage of this moment to get from 70% of our population with a broadband internet to well into the 90s. And you think that can be done over the next 5 to 7 years?
Yes. Yeah. Look, there's a lot of execution risk. There are a lot of people going to the government saying, here's how you solve this. I'm in some of those discussions. Other smart people are. Like anything else, whenever there's a lot of money, there are some people who aren't so smart trying to get the government to do those things. But it's interesting. I live near DC. I'm involved in DC. The politics of broadband. DC is not a very functional place these days. We can debate the causes of it, whatever. But on broadband, there really was a pretty good bipartisan consensus about asking how do we solve this problem. And when you look at the infrastructure bill, you saw Democrats and Republicans come together, not just as they did on traditional infrastructure like roads and bridges, but for this new infrastructure. And so I'm hopeful that government now has the necessary resources to actually solve these problems. But again, if we don't solve them, they're going to get worse, and we're never going to get this kind of influx of money to do it again.
Well,
so now's the
Blair
time to
Levin,
put together a wish list.
Well, let's do it. We'll get to work down here in Miami. We so appreciate your time. Blair Levin, thank you very much.
Thank you, and good luck.
As we think about Miami's economic future, fundamental to the effort is internet access for all. And that opportunity is in front of us. Getting nearly all households across Miami-Dade County connected online is within reach. Now the question is if we can seize this opportunity and make the reality of internet in each and every home as common as electricity or running water, and make the digital divide once and for all a thing of the past. Let's connect on social. Meet us online and hope to see you in person around Miami too. And of course, we'll see you next time on Opportunity Miami.